At 11:57 p.m. on the night of March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam began to collapse. It was a concrete gravity dam in San Francisco Canyon, about 40 miles northwest of Los Angeles, California. The dam stood over 200 feet tall and held back nearly 12.5 billion gallons of water in the newly created St. Francis Reservoir. Everything had seemed stable only hours earlier. The dam keeper, a man named Tony Harnischfeger, had made his usual rounds along the crest of the dam at around 7 p.m. that evening. He reported no unusual cracks, no leaks, no signs of distress. But at 11:57, the center section of the dam suddenly gave way. The concrete buckled, then shattered, and the entire structure began to slide forward on its foundation. Within minutes, a wall of water as high as 140 feet was roaring down the canyon at speeds approaching 18 miles per hour. The flood wave carried an estimated 10 billion gallons of water, along with enormous chunks of concrete, boulders, and debris. At 12:03 a.m. on March 13th, the water smashed into the first inhabited area, the construction camp at Powerhouse No. 2, about 2 miles downstream. Every building was obliterated. The second powerhouse, Powerhouse No. 1, was next. The night shift workers had no warning. Then the flood swept into the Santa Clara River Valley, moving toward the towns of Fillmore, Santa Paula, and the coastal areas near Ventura. By the time the water reached the ocean at about 5:30 a.m., the flood had traveled more than 50 miles. The death toll was never precisely determined, but the official count settled at 432. Many bodies were never recovered. Some were found miles away or buried under deep layers of mud and debris. The St. Francis Dam collapse remains the deadliest civil engineering failure in American history. What happened? The dam was built as part of the larger Los Angeles aqueduct system, which had been completed in 1903. The aqueduct brought water from the Owens Valley to the rapidly growing city of Los Angeles. But by the mid-1900s, the city needed more water, and the aqueduct's capacity was insufficient during dry years. The solution was to build a storage reservoir in San Francisco Canyon, where the aqueduct already passed. The St. Francis Dam would hold water that could be released during peak demand. The chief engineer of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, William Mulholland, personally oversaw the design and construction. Mulholland was a legendary figure in Southern California water engineering. He had been the driving force behind the aqueduct, a feat that had transformed the region. He was trusted implicitly by the city's leaders and the public. The dam was his project from start to finish. Construction began in August 1924. The site was a narrow canyon with steep walls composed mostly of schist and conglomerate rock. The dam was designed as a concrete gravity structure, essentially a solid wedge of concrete that relied on its own weight to resist the pressure of the water. The original design called for a height of about 175 feet, but during construction the height was increased to 210 feet. The base was widened accordingly. The dam was built in stages with concrete poured in blocks. The work was completed in May 1926 and the reservoir began filling. Over the next 2 years, the water level rose and fell as the aqueduct delivered water. There were minor problems. Cracks appeared in the dam and small leaks were noted. Mulholland inspected the dam personally on several occasions. He was not alarmed. Cracking and seepage were common in concrete dams of the era. The dam was considered safe. Everyone involved thought the dam was stable. The dam keeper, Harnischfeger, lived in a house just below the dam. On the morning of March 12th, he had noticed some new small leaks coming from the base of the dam near the west abutment. He reported this to his superiors. Mulholland and his assistant, Harvey Van Norman, drove out to the dam that afternoon. They walked the entire length of the crest, examined the leaks, and pronounced the dam safe. Mulholland was quoted as saying, "I am perfectly safe in saying that I have never seen any indication of a serious leak in the dam." He later told reporters that the water seeping out was clear, which meant it was not carrying away the dam's foundation. That was considered a good sign. At around 7 p.m., after Mulholland and Van Norman left, Harnischfeger made his final rounds. He saw nothing unusual. He went to bed. Less than 5 hours later, the dam was gone. Investigators later pieced together the sequence of the failure. The first sign of trouble may have been a sudden increase in seepage or a deep cracking sound that was heard by a few people living below the dam, but no one in a position to act heard it in time. At 11:57 p.m., the dam failed catastrophically. The center section toppled forward and disintegrated. The two end sections remained standing for a brief moment, then also collapsed. The entire failure lasted only a few minutes. The water emptied the reservoir almost completely within about 70 minutes. The investigation that followed was conducted by a commission of engineers appointed by the state of California. They interviewed witnesses, examined the site, studied the geology, and analyzed the concrete. Several key factors emerged. The first factor was the geology of the site. The dam had been built on two different types of rock. The east abutment was on a hard, durable schist. The west abutment was on a much softer, crumbly conglomerate, a mixture of sand, gravel, and clay. This conglomerate was water sensitive. When it became saturated, it lost strength and began to slide. The dam's foundation on the west side was not properly keyed into solid rock. The concrete was poured directly onto the conglomerate, which then softened and allowed the dam to shift. There was evidence that the west abutment had been moving for some time before the collapse. Small cracks and seepage along the west side were early warnings that were not recognized. The second factor was the design itself. The dam was a gravity structure, but its cross-section was relatively thin for its height. Modern design standards would have required a thicker base to ensure stability. The decision to raise the dam height during construction without a proportional increase in base width made the structure even more susceptible to overturning. The dam's internal drainage system was also inadequate. Water pressure building up inside the dam, known as uplift pressure, can reduce the effective weight of the concrete and cause sliding. The dam had no systematic drainage galleries to relieve this pressure. Once the foundation began to fail, the dam could not hold. The third factor was the lack of independent oversight. Mulholland was the sole authority on the project. He had designed the dam with minimal input from other engineers. There was no external review board, no regulatory agency checking his calculations or his site assessments. The culture of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power was one of confidence in Mulholland. He had built the aqueduct against all odds. He was considered infallible. That confidence proved misplaced. The fourth factor was the speed of the failure. A properly built concrete dam does not fail without warning signs that can be seen hours or days in advance. But in this case, the warning signs were subtle and were dismissed. The dam keeper's observations of increased seepage were noted but not acted upon. Mulholland's inspection on the day of the collapse found the dam safe. The final triggering event was likely the sudden saturation of the conglomerate foundation due to a combination of rain and reservoir levels. Once the foundation gave way, the dam could not stand. Who was involved? William Mulholland was the central figure. He was 62 years old at the time of the collapse. He had been the chief engineer of the Los Angeles water system since its inception. He was respected, even revered, but after the collapse he was blamed. He testified before the investigation commission and took full responsibility. "Don't blame anyone else, you just fasten it on me," he said. "If there was an error in judgment, I was that error." He never worked as an engineer again. He died in 1935, a broken man. His assistant, Harvey Van Norman, continued in the water department and later became its chief engineer. The dam keeper, Tony Harnischfeger, was killed in the flood along with his wife and son. Their bodies were never found. The victims were primarily workers at the powerhouses and residents of the small communities along the Santa Clara River. Many were Mexican-American and Filipino laborers who had built the aqueduct and now worked at the power plants. Their names are listed on a memorial at the collapse site, but many remain unknown. The flood destroyed entire neighborhoods. In the town of Santa Paula, the water was 20 feet deep in places. Survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by a wall of darkness that carried houses, trees, and animals. The disaster was one of the worst in California history. What investigators found in the aftermath was a dam that had failed from the foundation up. The concrete itself was not the primary cause. Samples were tested and found to have adequate strength. The problem was the rock beneath. The west abutment had simply turned to mud. The Commission's final report, issued in 1929, concluded that the failure was due to the inherent weakness of the rock on which the dam rested. It also noted that the design did not account for the geological conditions and that the dam was not built to withstand the uplift pressure that developed. Why does this event still matter? The St. Francis Dam collapse changed the practice of dam engineering in the United States. Before 1928, dam design was largely unregulated. After the disaster, California established the first state division of dam safety, tasked with reviewing all dam designs and inspecting construction. The federal government followed with the creation of the Army Corps of Engineers Dam Safety Program. The collapse also led to the adoption of new design standards for concrete gravity dams, including requirements for drainage systems, foundation treatment, and independent review. The tragedy was a catalyst for the modern dam safety profession, but the story is not only about engineering, it is about the limits of human confidence. William Mulholland was a brilliant man who had accomplished what many thought impossible, but he was also a man who trusted his own judgment too much. He ignored the geology. He ignored the leaks. He ignored the possibility that the dam might fail. The result was a catastrophe that killed hundreds and ended his career. The St. Francis Dam collapse is a lesson in hubris, in the danger of unchecked authority, and in the necessity of asking hard questions even when the answers are unwelcome. It is a story that remains relevant to any large infrastructure project, any system that depends on expert judgment, any decision that affects thousands of lives. The dam is gone, but the questions it raised are still with us. In the years that followed, the St. Francis Dam collapse became a touchstone for engineers and regulators. The Investigation Commission released its final report on March 14, 1929, nearly 1 year after the disaster. The report was detailed, spanning more than 100 pages. It included photographs, maps, calculations, and testimony from more than 50 witnesses. The commission did not mince words. It stated that the failure was caused by the foundation rock on the west abutment, which was a conglomerate of sand, gravel, and clay that softened when wet. The report noted that the dam had been built without proper drainage, without sufficient keying into solid rock, and without a thorough geological survey. The commission recommended that all future dams in California be subject to independent review, and that the state establish a division to oversee dam safety. The first hearings began on March 19, 1928, just days after the collapse. They were held in Los Angeles and later in Santa Paula. William Mulholland testified for several hours. He was composed but clearly shaken. He described how he had inspected the dam on the afternoon of March 12th, saw the seepage, and considered it normal. He admitted that he had not consulted a geologist before construction. He said he had relied on his own experience. When asked why he had not ordered a geological survey, he replied that he had seen the rock exposed in the canyon walls and believed it was adequate. The commissioners pressed him on the decision to raise the dam by 10 feet during construction. Mulholland said he had recalculated the stresses and thought the design was still safe. He was wrong. The coroner's inquest was held separately, beginning on March 21st. It was presided over by the Los Angeles County coroner, Frank Nance. The jury heard from survivors, engineers, and experts. One witness was a local rancher named John S. McGroarty, who had lived near the dam. He testified that he had noticed cracks in the hillside above the dam several weeks before the collapse. He reported them to a foreman, but nothing was done. Another witness was a power plant worker named George W. Thomas, who was on duty the night of the collapse. He described hearing a deep rumble, then a roar, and then seeing a wall of water approaching his plant. He ran uphill and survived. He said he had never been warned about the possibility of a dam failure. The inquest also heard from geologists. One was Dr. John C. Branner, a former president of Stanford University and a respected geologist. He had examined the site after the collapse and testified that the foundation rock was entirely unsuitable for a concrete dam. He said that any competent geologist would have recognized the danger. Another geologist, Dr. Robert T. Hill, had actually visited the site during construction in 1925 and warned Mulholland about the conglomerate. Hill later wrote an article for the Engineering News Record in which he criticized Mulholland's decision to ignore geological advice. The article was widely read and caused a stir in the engineering community. The coroner's jury returned its verdict on April 5, 1928. It found that the disaster was caused by the failure of the foundation of the dam. It did not assign criminal liability, but it recommended that the state legislature create a board of engineers to approve all dam designs. It also suggested that no dam should be built without a thorough geological investigation. The jury's recommendations were largely adopted. The political fallout was immediate. The Los Angeles City Council launched an investigation of its own. The state legislature passed the California Dam Safety Act in 1929, creating the State Division of Dam Safety within the Department of Public Works. The division was given authority to review plans, inspect construction, and order modifications to existing dams. It was the first such agency in the United States. Other states soon followed. By 1935, New York, Pennsylvania, and Colorado had established similar programs. The engineering community also took stock. The American Society of Civil Engineers formed a committee to study the failure. The committee's report, published in 1930, emphasized the importance of foundation treatment and internal drainage. It recommended that all gravity dams be equipped with drainage galleries to relieve uplift pressure. It also called for independent peer review of all large dam projects. These standards became part of the ASCE's guidelines and later influenced the design of Hoover Dam, which was built just 7 years after the St. Francis disaster. The human cost was not forgotten. The official death toll was eventually set at about 430 people, though the exact number remains uncertain. Many bodies were never recovered. The flood had swept victims all the way to the Pacific Ocean, some 45 miles downstream. In the weeks after the disaster, search parties combed the riverbed and the beaches. They found bodies tangled in debris, buried under silt, or washed out to sea. The last known victim was found in May 1928, 2 months after the collapse. Survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. One survivor, a 12-year-old boy named Raymond Weeks, lived with his family in a small house near the power plant. He was asleep when the water hit. He was swept away but managed to grab a floating piece of lumber. He drifted for several hours before being rescued. His parents and siblings were killed. He later became a carpenter and never spoke publicly about the disaster. Another survivor, a Filipino laborer named Pedro Flores, was working at the powerhouse when the wall of water arrived. He ran uphill and survived by clinging to a tree. He lost his brother and his cousin. He later moved to San Francisco and never returned to the canyon. The memorial at the collapse site was dedicated in 1978, 50 years after the disaster. It is a simple stone monument with a bronze plaque listing the names of the known victims. The plaque has 308 names, but many are listed as unknown. The site is now a state historic landmark. Visitors can walk the road that once ran along the dam crest. The remains of the two end sections still stand, cracked and weedy. The reservoir basin is empty, a flat plain of dry mud and brush. The canyon is quiet. Engineering students still study the St. Francis Dam. It is a case study in the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of geological investigation. Every dam safety textbook includes a chapter on the collapse. The disaster is often compared to the Johnstown flood of 1889, which killed over 2,000 people, and to the Teton Dam failure of 1976, which killed 11 but caused extensive damage. In each case, the root cause was a failure to understand the site conditions. The St. Francis Dam collapse also raised questions about the ethics of infrastructure development. William Mulholland was building a water system for a growing city. The aqueduct and the dam were essential to Los Angeles' expansion. But the rush to complete the project, the lack of oversight, and the dismissal of expert warnings all contributed to the tragedy. The disaster is a reminder that progress must be tempered with caution, that authority must be checked, and that human lives should not be sacrificed for speed or profit. In the end, the St. Francis Dam collapse was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made failure. The dam was built by human hands, designed by a human mind, and approved by a human decision. The mistakes were avoidable. The warnings were there. The tragedy happened because no one in a position of power took them seriously. That pattern repeats itself in other fields, other industries, other times. The dam is gone, but the questions it raised are still with us, waiting to be asked again. At 11:57 p.m. on March 12, 1928, the last telephone call from the St. Francis Dam site was made. It was placed by a security guard named Tony Harnischfeger, who was stationed at the dam's crest. He called the main office at the powerhouse number 2 downstream. The call was brief. Harnischfeger reported that the seepage along the base of the dam had increased since the afternoon inspection. He said the water was flowing more rapidly and that small rocks were being carried out from the hillside. The dispatcher on the other end of the line took the report and told Harnischfeger to stay at his post. The dispatcher did not call William Mulholland or anyone else at the Water Bureau. There was no formal protocol for escalating such observations. The guard hung up. The seepage continued. At 11:59 p.m., a watchman at the same powerhouse looked up from his post. He saw a cloud of dust rising from the canyon upstream. It was white and thick, lit by the moon. He thought it was a landslide. He did not know that the dam had already begun to move. The concrete structure was cracking under the pressure of the reservoir. The foundation on the west side, the conglomerate rock that geologists had warned about, was dissolving. The water was lifting the base of the dam from below. The dam was no longer anchored. It was floating on the force of the water it was supposed to contain. At 12:01 a.m. on March 13th, the dam gave way. The center section of the concrete gravity structure failed first. It did not collapse in a single moment. It failed in stages like a row of dominoes. The west end went first, then the center, then the east end. The entire dam disintegrated in about 5 minutes. The reservoir, holding 38,000 acre-feet of water, enough to fill 18,000 Olympic swimming pools, emptied in less than 70 minutes. The wall of water that surged down San Francisco Canyon was initially about 140 feet high at the dam site. By the time it reached the power plant 2 miles downstream, it had slowed and spread, but was still more than 50 feet high. It carried with it chunks of concrete, boulders, trees, and the bodies of people who lived in the canyon. What happened next was not a flood. It was a wave that did not stop. The water traveled at speeds exceeding 18 miles per hour through the narrow canyon. It struck the powerhouse number 2 at 12:03 a.m. The building was made of reinforced concrete and brick. It was designed to withstand earthquakes. It was not designed to withstand a wall of water. The wave demolished the structure in seconds. The turbines and generators were ripped from their foundations. The workers inside, those who were not already running, were killed instantly. The only survivors at the powerhouse were those who had already fled to higher ground after hearing the rumble. One of those survivors was George W. Thomas, the power plant worker who later testified at the inquest. He had been on duty in the control room. He heard a deep grinding noise from upstream. Then he heard a roar. He looked out the window and saw a white mass advancing down the canyon. He ran for the door, climbed the hill behind the plant, and did not stop until he reached the ridge. He later said the water passed within 50 yards of his position. He saw the building collapse and the debris field form. He also saw the lights go out across the valley. The flood had knocked down power lines. The entire region went dark. At 12:05 a.m., the flood reached the first residential areas. These were small communities of workers, mostly Mexican and Filipino laborers who lived in houses near the power plant and along the creek. The houses were wooden frames with tin roofs. They had no foundations. The wave swept them away as if they were toys. Families were sleeping. They had no warning. There were no sirens, no telephone calls, no evacuation orders. The only indication was the roar, and by the time that was heard, it was too late. At 12:15 a.m., the flood entered the broad alluvial plain of the Santa Clara River. Here it spread out, slowing but still carrying tremendous force. It reached the town of Castaic Junction, where a few dozen houses stood near the river. The water did not flood the town gradually. It arrived as a moving wall with debris. It killed everyone in its path. At 12:30 a.m., the flood passed the town of Saugus. It destroyed the bridge over the Santa Clara River and isolated the community. By now, the wave had slowed to about 6 miles per hour, but it was still a mile wide and 10 feet deep. It carried cars, animals, and building materials. At 1 a.m., the flood reached the town of Santa Paula. This was a larger community with thousands of residents. The water entered the town from the east, moving through the riverbed and then overtopping the banks. It flooded the main street, washing away businesses and homes. The local fire department tried to warn residents by ringing the town bell, but many did not understand what was happening. Those who lived near the river were the first to drown. The water rose slowly enough that some people had time to climb to second floors or rooftops. But the debris in the water, broken lumber, sharp metal, and concrete fragments, made escape difficult. People who were caught in the flood were battered, crushed, and dragged under. At 2 a.m., the flood reached the town of Ventura near the coast. The water was now spread across the entire floodplain. It was only 3 feet deep in most places, but it still carried debris and bodies. The flood entered the Ventura River estuary, and then the Pacific Ocean at 2:30 a.m. The water turned the ocean brown for miles offshore. The flood had traveled 45 miles in 2.5 hours. It had killed over 400 people. Most of the bodies washed out to sea. How could this have happened? The disaster was not a single mistake. It was a chain of failures, each one avoidable. The first failure was the site selection. Mulholland chose the location without a geological survey. The bedrock was a weak conglomerate, a mixture of gravel, sand, and clay that had been cemented together by natural minerals. This rock was permeable and soluble. Water could dissolve the cement and turn the rock into loose sediment. That is exactly what happened. The water from the reservoir seeped into the foundation, dissolved the binder, and created a leak path. Over time, the leak enlarged. The dam began to lift. The concrete cracked. The structure lost its stability. The second failure was the design. The St. Francis Dam was a concrete gravity dam, meaning it relied on its own weight to hold back the water. For a gravity dam to be stable, the foundation must be strong enough to support the weight and the shear forces. The St. Francis Dam's foundation was not strong enough. The dam was also built on a curve in the canyon, which created uneven pressure on the foundation. The west side was higher and weaker. That is where the failure began. The third failure was the construction. The dam was built quickly. Mulholland was under pressure to complete the Los Angeles Aqueduct project. He had already built the Owens Valley Aqueduct, which opened in 1903. The St. Francis Dam was intended to store water from the aqueduct for use during dry months. The dam was originally planned to be 160 feet high, but during construction, Mulholland ordered the height raised to 185 feet. This increased the load on the foundation. The extra 10 feet of concrete added thousands of tons of weight. The foundation was never tested for that load. The fourth failure was the inspection. Mulholland visited the dam on the afternoon of March 12th. He saw the seepage, which was flowing at about 2 to 3 cubic feet per second. He considered it normal. He did not order any measurements. He did not test the water chemistry. He did not consult an expert. He left. The seepage continued to increase. By 11 p.m., the flow had doubled. No one reported it. No one stopped it. The fifth failure was the lack of emergency planning. The dam had no early warning system. There was no way to alert downstream residents. The power plant had telephones, but the calls that were made did not reach anyone who could evacuate the valley. The guard at the dam reported the increased seepage, but no one acted. The dispatcher did not even call the Water Bureau superintendent. If a single person had made the decision to sound an alarm at 11:30 p.m., many lives could have been saved, but no one made that decision. The investigation that followed revealed more failures. The coroner's inquest heard testimony that the dam's foundation had been compromised by a large fault line that ran through the canyon. The fault was known to local geologists, but Mulholland either did not know or chose to ignore it. The fault had not been mapped during the site survey. The dam was built directly over it. When the reservoir filled, the water infiltrated the fault, lubricated the fracture, and caused the west side of the dam to slide. The State Division of Dam Safety, created in the aftermath, conducted a detailed study of the failure. The study took 3 years. It concluded that the dam's foundation had been entirely unsuitable and that the design had been inadequate for the site. The report was damning. It said that Mulholland's belief in his own experience had led him to disregard basic engineering principles. The report was not published until 1931, by which time Mulholland had already retired. He died in 1935, a broken and disgraced man. He never publicly apologized for the disaster. He did, however, visit the site several times after the collapse. He stood on the remaining sections of the dam and looked at the empty reservoir. He did not speak. The legal aftermath was complex. The victims' families filed civil lawsuits against the city of Los Angeles. The city argued that the dam's failure was an act of God, that no one could have predicted the foundation's weakness. The courts rejected this argument. In 1932, a jury awarded damages to several families. The city paid out more than $1 million in settlements, but the money did not bring back the dead. The lawsuits were settled quietly. No criminal charges were ever brought against anyone. The disaster had a profound effect on California's water policy. The state legislature passed the Dam Safety Act in 1929, but it was not enough. In 1931, the legislature created the State Water Resources Control Board, which regulated water rights and dam safety. The board's first task was to inspect every dam in the state. They found many unsafe structures. Several dams were modified or removed. The St. Francis Dam collapse had created a culture of caution that lasted for decades. But the disaster also had a dark legacy. William Mulholland's career was over, but his philosophy of aggressive infrastructure development continued. The Los Angeles aqueduct system was expanded. New dams were built on the Colorado River, including Hoover Dam and Parker Dam. These projects were built with careful geological surveys and peer review, but they also came with environmental and social costs. The water diverted from the Owens Valley, and the Colorado River allowed Los Angeles to become the major city it is today. But the Native American communities, farmers and ranchers who lost their water rights, were never fully compensated. The St. Francis Dam collapse was the first major failure in the era of modern dam building. It was not the last. In 1963, the Baldwin Hills Dam in Los Angeles failed, killing 5 people. That dam was also an earthfill structure built on a fault line. In 1976, the Teton Dam in Idaho failed, killing 11 people and causing billions of dollars in damage. That dam was built on volcanic rock that fractured under pressure. In 2015, the Fundão Dam in Brazil collapsed, killing 19 people and releasing toxic mining waste that devastated the environment. In each case, the pattern was similar: inadequate site investigation, poor construction oversight, and a failure to listen to warnings. The St. Francis Dam collapse remains one of the deadliest dam failures in American history. Only the Johnstown flood of 1889, which killed over 2,000 people, was worse. But the St. Francis disaster stands as a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge and the cost of overconfidence. Mulholland was a self-taught engineer. He had no formal education. He learned by doing. He built the aqueduct that brought water to a desert city. He was hailed as a hero. But he also built a dam on a foundation that was bound to fail. The hero became a villain. The line between success and catastrophe was a thin one, measured in feet of concrete and gallons of seepage. Today, the site of the St. Francis Dam is quiet. The reservoir basin is a flat, dry plain covered with sagebrush and tumbleweeds. The two remaining sections of the dam, the west end and the east end, still stand, about 50 feet apart. They are made of concrete that is now gray and cracked. Visitors can walk up to them. There is a chain-link fence around the site, but it is easy to climb over. The plaque from 1978 is still there, listing the known victims, about 308 names. Many are missing. The canyon is silent except for the wind. But the questions are not silent. They echo in every engineering classroom where the St. Francis Dam is discussed. They appear in every dam safety manual that requires a geological survey before construction. They surface in every emergency planning meeting where someone asks, "What if the dam fails?" They haunt every regulatory agency that has to approve a new dam project. The dam is gone, but the questions it raised are still with us, waiting to be asked again. At 2:30 a.m. on the 13th of March 1928, rescue boats arrived at the Edison power plant site. The power plant was gone. Only the concrete foundation remained. The floodwaters had torn the building from its bolts and carried it 600 feet downstream. Debris was scattered across the canyon floor. Rescuers used lanterns and flashlights. They found the first bodies within minutes. A man in a work shirt, his legs pinned under a steel beam. A woman clutching a child, both covered in mud and oil. The water was still high. The boats could not reach every victim. Many bodies were swept away in the current, never to be found. What happened in the hours after the collapse was a scramble against darkness. The flood had traveled at an estimated 40 miles per hour through the canyon. It reached Castaic Junction 35 minutes after the dam broke. It reached the Santa Clara River Valley by 2 a.m. By then, the wave had spread out into a mile-wide wall of water and debris. Houses that were still standing in the path were filled with mud up to the second floor. Trees were uprooted. Cars were rolled into piles. The Los Angeles Times later reported that the flood had covered an area 150 square miles in mud and wreckage. At sunrise on March 13th, the scale of the disaster became visible. Helicopters did not yet exist. Aerial photographs were taken from biplanes. Pilots flew low over the valley and saw a landscape that looked like a war zone. The concrete remains of the dam stood in two shattered sections. The reservoir was empty. The canyon below was a chasm of mud, boulders, and twisted metal. The search for survivors began in earnest. Local residents, farmers, and volunteers joined the effort. They walked through the debris, calling out names. They dug through piles of wreckage with their hands. The first official death count was announced at noon, 150 dead with hundreds missing. The identification process was grueling. Many bodies were unrecognizable. The flood had stripped clothing, torn limbs, and crushed faces. Coroners set up temporary morgues in schools and churches. Families came to identify the dead by their belongings. A pocket watch with an engraving, a ring, a pair of boots. The Ruiz family was identified by a photograph found in a waterproof case. The mother had been carrying it in her apron. The photograph showed the family at a wedding in 1928. All 5 members of the Ruiz family had died. The photograph was the only reason they could be named. By March 15th, 3 days after the collapse, the official death count had risen to 230, but many bodies had been swept out to the Pacific Ocean. The flood had traveled 54 miles from the dam site to the sea. Bodies were found on beaches in Ventura and Oxnard. Some were never recovered. The final death toll would be revised multiple times over the following decades. Historians now estimate that between 308 and 350 people died. The exact number will never be known, because no complete census existed for the ranches and migrant camps in the valley. The state of California did not require death certificates for all victims until later that year. The disaster was not only a human tragedy, it was also an engineering crime scene. On March 16th, Governor C.C. Young appointed a board of inquiry. The board included engineers from the University of California, the State Division of Highways, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. They arrived at the dam site on March 17th. They spent 3 weeks examining the remains. They took coarse samples of the concrete. They measured the foundation. They studied the geology of the canyon. Their report was released on April 13, 1928. It was 130 pages long. It concluded that the dam had failed because the foundation was weak, the design was flawed, and the construction was rushed. But the board also found something else. The report noted that Mulholland had not consulted a geologist before building. It noted that he had ordered the dam raised without recalculating the foundation pressure. It noted that the seepage had been observed for months but never measured. The report did not use the word negligence, but the implication was clear. The board wrote that the dam was built on a foundation that was entirely unsuitable and that the design was inadequate for the site. They recommended that all dams in California be inspected every year. They also recommended that no dam be built without a geological survey. These recommendations would become law, but only after a long fight. The coroner's inquest began on March 21st in Los Angeles. The jury heard testimony from engineers, geologists, and dam workers. Mulholland testified on March 22nd. He was composed but subdued. He said he had inspected the dam on the afternoon of March 12th and had seen nothing wrong. He said the seepage was normal for a new dam. He said he had no doubt the dam was safe. When asked about the foundation, he said he had tested it by digging a trench and filling it with water. The water drained. He considered that proof the ground was stable. The geologist who testified after him said that the trench test was meaningless because it only tested the surface. The real weakness was deep underground, along a fault line that Mulholland had never looked for. The inquest lasted 5 days. The jury returned a verdict on March 27. They found that the dam collapse was caused by a defective foundation and that the city of Los Angeles was responsible. They did not name any individuals as criminally liable. The verdict was a compromise. The city avoided criminal charges, but the civil lawsuits that followed would cost millions. The inquest also led to the creation of the California State Division of Dam Safety, which began inspecting all dams in 119. The division was small at first, with only 3 engineers, but it was a start. The human cost of the disaster continued to unfold for years. Families who lost their homes filed claims against the city. The city initially refused to pay, arguing that the dam failure was an act of God. The courts rejected that argument. In 1930, the first major trial resulted in a verdict of $50,000 for the family of a rancher who had died. Trial set a precedent. By 1932, the city had paid more than $1 million in settlements. That amount is equivalent to about $18 million today, but the money could not bring back the dead. Many families went bankrupt anyway. The disaster had destroyed their livelihoods, their land, and their history. The long-term impact on California water policy was profound. The Dam Safety Act of 1929 required that all dams be designed by licensed engineers. It required geological surveys. It required annual inspections. But the act had a loophole. It only applied to new dams. Existing dams were grandfathered in. It took the Baldwin Hills Dam failure in 1963 to close that loophole. After that, the state began a systematic review of all older dams. Many were found to be unsafe and were either modified or decommissioned. The St. Francis Dam collapse had set in motion a culture of dam safety that saved lives for decades, but it came at a terrible price. The collapse also changed the way engineers think about failure. Before St. Francis, many engineers believed that concrete dams were safe because they were made of strong material. They believed that a dam could not fail if it was built thick enough and high enough. The St. Francis disaster proved that the foundation mattered more than the dam itself. A dam is only as strong as the ground it sits on. That lesson became a fundamental principle of geotechnical engineering. It is taught in every civil engineering program today. But the disaster also revealed a darker lesson about human nature. Mulholland's arrogance was not unique. It was common among the engineers of his era, who believed they could conquer nature with concrete and steel. The St. Francis Dam was not the last project built on weak foundations. In 1976, the Teton Dam in Idaho failed because the volcanic rock under the dam fractured under the weight of the water. In 2015, the Fundão Dam in Brazil failed because the tailings pond was built on an unstable slope. In both cases, engineers ignored warnings. In both cases, people died. The St. Francis Dam collapse remains a quiet monument to overconfidence. The site is a state historic landmark now. The plaque from 1978 is faded and rusted. The chain-link fence around the dam remnants is bent and broken. Visitors come to the canyon every year. Some leave flowers, some leave notes. One note found in 2022 read, "Mulholland, you should have listened." The canyon has become a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand how a single mistake can drown a valley. The silence there is heavy. The wind does not fill it. At 11:57 p.m. on March 12, 1928, the guard at the dam saw the concrete begin to crumble. He ran. He survived. He later testified that he heard a sound like thunder, then a roar that lasted for 3 minutes. He said the ground shook. He said the water came down the canyon like a wall of black glass. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew what he had seen. The guard died in 1963 at the age of 78. He never spoke about the dam again, but his testimony remains in the court records. It is one of the few first-hand accounts of the exact moment the St. Francis Dam collapsed. The dam was built to bring water to a growing city. It brought water, yes, but it also brought death. The city of Los Angeles did not run out of water after the dam failed. The aqueduct was repaired within months. New storage was built in the Owens Valley, but the canyon where the dam once stood remained empty. The concrete remnants are still there, 2 jagged pieces of wall standing in the dry bed of San Francisco Canyon. They are the only reminder of the mistake that drowned a valley. The valley itself is silent now, but the questions are not. They are asked in every engineering classroom, in every dam safety meeting, in every moment when someone decides that speed is more important than caution. The dam is gone, but the questions remain. They will always remain. At 6:12 a.m. on March 13, 1928, the sheriff of Ventura County received a telephone call from a rancher near the Santa Clara River. The man was breathless. He said the river had risen 15 feet in 10 minutes. He said the water was carrying trees, cattle, and pieces of houses. He said he heard screaming. The sheriff dispatched deputies to the river. They found bodies tangled in debris. They found a child's shoe. They found a car upside down in a field. By 7 a.m., the sheriff had called the State Highway Patrol. By 7:30, the governor had been notified. The disaster was no longer a local event. It was a statewide emergency. What the rescuers found that morning defied comprehension. The flood wave had traveled at 30 miles per hour through the narrow canyon. It had scoured the valley floor to bare bedrock in many places. Houses that had been standing at midnight were gone by dawn. In the town of Santa Paula, 50 bodies were recovered within the first 2 hours. Many were found in trees, stripped of clothing by the force of the water. Others were found buried under silt that had been deposited 2 feet deep. The undertakers in Santa Paula ran out of coffins by noon. The Red Cross set up a temporary morgue in a school gymnasium. It filled within hours. The official death toll was announced at 9 a.m. on March 14th. It was 423. But that number was preliminary. The search continued for weeks. Divers searched the reservoir basin where the dam had stood. They found no bodies. Most victims had been swept all the way to the ocean. The final death toll was later revised to between 431 and 600 people. The exact number will never be known because many migrant workers and undocumented families lived in the valley. Their names were never recorded. The response was chaotic because there was no plan. The city of Los Angeles had not prepared an emergency evacuation protocol. The dam had no warning system. There was no siren, no telephone tree, no downstream alarm. The only warning came from the water itself. At 11:57 p.m., the guard saw the dam crumble. He ran and tried to call the power plant downstream. The phone line was already dead because the flood had snapped the poles. He drove his truck down the canyon as fast as he could, honking his horn. He reached the first settlement, but the water caught him. He survived by climbing a hillside. The people in the houses below did not. The failure of communication was not an accident. It was a direct result of corner cutting. Mulholland had decided that a siren system was unnecessary because the dam was watched by a guard. But the guard had no way to warn anyone beyond shouting distance. The phone line was a single strand of copper wire strung along the canyon wall. It was not buried. It was not redundant. When the flood snapped the wire, the entire warning system collapsed. The question that haunted investigators was simple. Why had no one considered that the phone line might fail at the same moment as the dam? The answer, they concluded, was that no one had considered the dam failing at all. The human cost of that oversight was measured in the testimony of survivors. A woman from Peru testified that she heard a roar and saw a wall of water approaching. She grabbed her 2 children and ran to high ground. She reached a hill just as the water destroyed her house. Her husband was not with her. He had been working late in the fields. His body was found 3 days later, 12 miles downstream. She told the coroner's jury that she had never been told the dam could break. She had never seen a warning. She had never heard a siren. She said she thought the dam was safe because it was built by the city of Los Angeles. That trust was misplaced. The city's Department of Water and Power had a reputation for competence, but that reputation was built on speed and secrecy. The aqueduct project had been rushed to meet the needs of a booming city. The St. Francis Dam was rushed because water storage was needed immediately. The design was approved without independent review. Mulholland was both the designer and the supervisor. He answered to no one but himself. The city's Board of Water Commissioners met only once a month. They signed off on the dam's plans without seeing the geological reports. The reports did not exist. After the coroner's inquest, the state legislature held hearings. The chairman of the hearing was a state senator from the Owens Valley, a man who had opposed the aqueduct from the beginning. He asked Mulholland directly, "Why did you build a dam on a fault line?" Mulholland answered that he did not know the fault was there. He said the canyon walls appeared solid. He said he had built dozens of dams before and none had failed. The senator asked if he had ever commissioned a geological survey. Mulholland said he had not. He said that geologists were expensive and that he could read the rocks himself. The senator asked if he still believed that. Mulholland did not answer. The hearings dragged on for months. They revealed a pattern of negligence that went beyond Mulholland. The city's water engineers had known about seepage under the dam for months. They had discussed it in memos. One memo, dated January 6, 1928, noted that the seepage was clear and likely safe. That memo was written by an assistant engineer who had no training in geology. The assistant did not measure the flow rate. He did not test the water for dissolved minerals. He did not drill test wells. He simply looked at the water, saw it was clear, and wrote that it was safe. That memo was later used in court as evidence of willful ignorance. The state's chief dam inspector had also failed. He had visited the St. Francis Dam twice during construction. Both times he had approved the work. He later testified that he had not checked the foundation because he assumed Mulholland had done so. The inspector had no geological training either. His job was simply to verify that the dam was built to the approved plans, but the approved plans themselves were flawed. The inspector did not have the authority to question the design. He could only check for compliance. The system of oversight was designed to prevent shoddy construction, not bad engineering. It failed completely. The disaster prompted the first comprehensive dam safety legislation in the United States. The California Dam Safety Act of 1929 established the Division of Safety of Dams within the State Department of Public Works. The division was given the power to approve all dam designs, conduct inspections, and order modifications. It was staffed with licensed engineers and geologists. The first chief of the division was a man named John V. Hanna, a civil engineer who had spent years working on irrigation projects. Hanna made it clear from the start that the division would not tolerate shortcuts. He wrote a letter to all dam owners in 1930 stating that any dam found to be unsafe would be ordered drained immediately. The letter was posted in every county courthouse, but the act had a critical weakness. It applied only to dams built after 1919. Existing dams were subject to inspection, but not to mandatory retrofitting. Many of them were just as poorly designed as the St. Francis. One of them, the Lower San Fernando Dam, was built in 1915 on a foundation of loose sand. It remained in operation for decades. In 1971, during the Silmar earthquake, the dam nearly failed. The water level was low at the time. Had it been full, the dam would have collapsed and flooded 40,000 homes in the San Fernando Valley. The near disaster was a direct echo of St. Francis. The lesson had been taught, but not fully learned. The St. Francis Dam collapse also changed the way dam failures are studied. Before 1928, most engineering textbooks treated dam failures as rare and unpredictable events. After 1928, textbooks began including chapters on foundation failure. The case study of St. Francis became a standard part of the civil engineering curriculum. Students were taught to ask 3 questions before any dam project. What is the geology of the site? What are the properties of the foundation? And what happens if the foundation fails? The answers to those questions became the basis for modern dam safety standards. The disaster had created a generation of engineers who would not make the same mistake. Yet the broader lesson was not only about engineering, it was about power and accountability. Mulholland was never charged with a crime. He resigned from the water department in 1928 and retired to a small house in Los Angeles. He died in 1935 at the age of 79. On his deathbed, he reportedly asked for forgiveness. He told a visitor that he had tried to do the right thing, but that he had been too confident. He said the blame was his alone. But the city of Los Angeles had also failed. The commissioners had approved his plans without question. The mayor had praised him as a hero. The public had trusted him because he delivered water. The disaster was a collective failure of oversight, not just one man's arrogance. In the years after the collapse, the canyon slowly healed. The reservoir was never refilled. The water was instead stored in new reservoirs built in the Owens Valley. The land around the dam site was acquired by the city and left to nature. The concrete remnants became a monument to caution. In 1978, the American Society of Civil Engineers declared the site a historic landmark. The plaque they installed reads, "The St. Francis Dam failure on March 12, 1928, caused the loss of more than 400 lives and resulted in the development of modern dam safety standards." The plaque does not mention Mulholland by name. The site is now part of the Angels National Forest. Hikers can walk to the base of the remaining fragments. They can touch the broken concrete. They can see the cracks that still run through the blocks, 70 years after the water stopped. But the most haunting remnant is not the concrete. It is the silence of the valley. The towns that were washed away were never rebuilt. The land is still empty. The only sound is the wind and the occasional bird. Visitors who come to the site often sit on the debris and stare at the empty canyon. They try to imagine the night when a wall of water came through. They try to imagine the screams. They try to imagine the sound of a dam collapsing, which witnesses described as a deep groan followed by a roar that lasted for minutes. The silence that follows is louder than any noise. The St. Francis Dam collapse remains one of the worst civil engineering disasters in American history. It is not the deadliest. That title belongs to the Johnstown flood of 1889, which killed over 2,000 people. But it is the most instructive. It shows how a single decision, made in the name of speed and expediency, can cascade into a catastrophe. It shows how a system of checks and balances can fail when the people who enforce them are too trusting. And it shows that the most dangerous substance on earth is not water or concrete, but human arrogance. The questions that the disaster raised are still relevant today. Every dam built in the 20th century is now aging. Some are over 100 years old. Their foundations are settling. Their concrete is cracking. Their spillways are undersized for modern climate conditions. The engineers who built them are long dead. The institutions that oversee them have been gutted by budget cuts. The lessons of St. Francis have been forgotten or ignored. In 2017, the Oroville Dam spillway crisis in California came within hours of a catastrophic failure. The emergency evacuation of 200,000 people was a direct result of poor maintenance and outdated design. The dam did not collapse, but it came close. The ghost of St. Francis was in the room. The valley that drowned is quiet now. The bodies that were buried in anonymous mass graves are mostly forgotten. The families that lost everything have scattered or died, but the concrete remains. It stands as a reminder that nature does not forgive shortcuts. It stands as a warning that every dam is a gamble, and it stands as a testament to the people who died because someone decided that speed was more important than caution. Their names are not on the plaque. Their stories are not in the textbooks, but their silence is the loudest lesson of all. At midnight on March 13, 1928, the flood reached the ocean. The water that had been stored behind the St. Francis Dam spread into the Pacific Ocean in a brown plume. It carried with it the remains of homes, crops, and lives. The ocean accepted it, indifferent. The tide swept it away. The people on the shore did not know what had happened inland. They would learn the next morning. They would never forget. The dam is gone, but the questions remain. They will always remain.